Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started here. It's great to see everybody and welcome to another live armchair exploration event. Just the 4 bullet points that we use for all of the presentations. We're going to be putting everybody on mute. So we ask that you do remain on mute for the duration of the presentation. If you hover over the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll find your video and mute settings, as well as the chat function. If you have any questions for Shirley during the presentation, you can enter them into the chat, and Caitlin, Robin, and myself will try to address those. At the end of the talk, we'll collect everything. And additionally, there will be time at the end of the presentation to unmute yourself and ask a question if you wish to do so. Shirley is now sharing her screen, so you should actually be looking at our first slide now. If you have any trouble with this, use the chat function, let us know, and we'll do our best to help you out. So that's kind of the Zoom rundown. Now I'd like to go ahead and introduce our lecturer for today, Dr. Shirley Campbell. From 1978 to 2017, Dr. Shirley Campbell taught anthropology at the Australian National University, the University of Canberra, and taught a semester at Dartmouth College as a guest professor. With a special interest in the Indigenous peoples of Australia, Melanesia, and the Pacific, nearly 4 decades of academic research and university teaching have led to Shirley's sound knowledge and understanding of many cultures around the world and the theoretical foundations that human societies share. Now widely traveled, Shirley has had firsthand experience of the ways in which communities form and developed distinct yet interrelated cultures. Shirley grew up exploring her suburban neighborhood in California. She went on to live in England, Australia, and Papua New Guinea, where she developed fluency in the Karaway language. She has sailed in ocean-going outrigger canoes while living for almost 2 years with the indigenous people in the Trobriand Islands, a tiny coral atoll in Papua New Guinea. Shirley has specialized in studying the anthropology of art, convinced that understanding the way people represent their ideas through art and architecture provides valuable insights into our perceptions and relationships with the world around us. She has contributed several academic papers to peer-reviewed journals and books, and has written a book recounting her research and experiences in the Trobriand Islands titled The Art of Kula. Shirley began working for Zegrahm Expeditions in 2008 and has been an essential and very much loved part of our expedition team, working as a lecturer and a Zodiac driver on board the ships and as an expedition leader for land-based programs. So at this time, I'd like to give everybody a warm welcome and turn things over to Dr. Shirley Campbell for her lecture presentation, The Secret Valleys of New Guinea.
Thank you, Kelsey. And if I didn't have an overinflated ego by now, I do.
That didn't even do you justice, Shirley, I'll tell you that.
Thank you so much. So let's explore some of the highlands of New Guinea, these secret valleys of New Guinea. Human populations living in the vast array of ecosystems and ecological zones within the island of New Guinea remained essentially undisturbed beyond their coastal borders in prehistory. It was only with people living in the islands around the coastal regions that they maintained some levels of various trade throughout the centuries, moving resources and information between these ecological zones. In particular, a few Indonesian kingdoms and sultanates from the 13th century maintained variously claimed lands on the western extremities of the island. And they claimed those areas, but predominantly they were interested in getting resources, bird feathers and other resources from the island. Despite this connection from the 13th century, the people of the island largely remained unknown to outsiders further afield. The first Europeans to arrive in the waters of New Guinea were the Portuguese and the Spanish, of course, in the early 16th century. Portuguese sailor Jorge de Menezes, being the first European visitor, named one of the islands Ilhas dos Papuas, translated as land of the fuzzy-haired people. But it was the Spaniard Ortiz de Retes who named the eastern part of the island Nueva Guinea as he sailed along the north coast from the east, sorry. And he named it that because he reckoned the people looked like the people that the Spanish had conquered in West African Guinea. He made a landing on the 20th of June in 1545 and took possession of the island for the Spanish crown. But it was much later when the other European countries made their claims to the island of New Guinea. And it was really the 19th century that they came in and made more inroads into the island. In 1828, it was the Dutch Netherlands, who had already had colonial proprietors in what is now modern Indonesia. And they claimed the western half, as you can see here. In 1883, interestingly, the British colony of Queensland claimed the southwestern part of the island. But in 1884, the British renounced that claim and claimed it for themselves. So it became a British colony, not just a Queensland British colony in 1884. And at the same time, Germany claimed the northeastern part of the island, naming it German New Guinea or Kaiser Wilhelmsland. Before the 1930s, maps of the island show that the land beyond the coastal fringes was impenetrable forested high mountain ranges. And they assumed that those people, there was no way that human populations could have gone up into those mountains. As one moved further into the coastal plains, indeed, they found that populations became more sparse and more sporadic. So for European colonists, it was just an impossibility that there were any humans up in that area. As most of you know, New Guinea lies on the Australian tectonic plate and just north of Australia. Many of you will have traveled with us either during the circumnavigation of the island, or you would have explored some of the other island, coastal regions and some of the other islands. Few of you, I suggest, have been up in the Highlands, particularly with me. There's only a handful of you that have been up in the Highlands with me. But as you can see from the map, that running through the island is this big, long, mountainous spine. Many of the mountains are over 4,000 feet, or 4,000 meters, or just over 13,000 feet. On either side of the spine, vast lowlands fall towards the seas on either side. And these stretch hundreds of kilometers and include lowland rainforests, extensive wetlands, savanna grasslands, and expansive mangrove swamps. Glaciers once capped several of the peaks on the island. These have gradually melted away, unfortunately, since the middle of the 20th century. The highest mountain is in Puncak Jaya, and that's located in the Indonesian Papuan side of the island, rising over 16,000 feet or nearly 5,000 meters. While the highest peak on the Papua New Guinea side is Mount Willem, which rises nearly 15,000 feet. Mount Gilaway, that you can see here, is a mere 12th highest mountain in the whole of the range. Island New Guinea is home to many of the world's known ecosystems. These range from the alpine tundra, savanna, montane, and lowland rainforests. Mangroves, wetlands, lakes, and extensive riverine ecosystems make up much of the island's landmass. In the seas around the island are some of the richest coral reefs and seagrass environments on the planet. However, the island was very different 50,000 years ago when the first Homo sapiens made relatively short sea voyages from the Sunda Shelf crossing the Wallace Line. So we'll get my cursor here and show you the Wallace Line, which runs right through there. You can see the Sunda Shelf and then the Sahu Shelf, which connects New Guinea and Australia. So this one shows you that it's a 90-kilometer sea voyage across to the Australian north coast. So crossing from Sunda across to, this is the beginning of the mainland of New Guinea, would have been lots of island hopping. And the estimate sorry, is 50,000 years ago, 60,000 years ago into Australia, 50,000 years ago, Homo sapiens came into the western extremities of the island of New Guinea. It was assumed that for most of New Guinea's human prehistory, people would have traveled along the coastal regions. Hugging the coastal regions is a much more conducive, much easier place to colonize. And it was assumed that they didn't go into the hinterland. However, archaeological evidence has suggested that that's quite different, that we have to rethink that because ancient artifacts were unearthed in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, particularly in that little part of the Azaro Valley in the Morobe district. Archaeologists found charred shell nuts from the pandanus. They found animal bones, and they found stone axes that dated 49,000 to 44,000 years old. So if the early ancestors of Papua New Guineans today arrived 50,000 years ago, they were already up into the high mountain areas 49 to 44,000 years ago. So no longer can we argue that these people were coastal huggers and didn't penetrate into the high mountain regions. The earliest evidence for agriculture, so those early ancestors were all hunter-gatherers. They were Stone Age hunter-gatherers. The earliest evidence for agriculture was developing around the same time as Mesopotamia, 10,000 years ago. And the earliest indicators were that the agriculturists were becoming agriculturists in the highlands, not on the coastal regions. And we know that because they developed some of the earliest known systems with extensive drainage and irrigation. Excuse me, it's my morning voice. The gardens of the New Guinea highlands are ancient, intensive permacultural systems. They have adapted to high mountainous conditions, including high rainfall, very steep mountainous terrains, and sometimes cold and frosty nights, often cold nights, but often frosty nights as well. They developed complex mulches, crop rotations and tillages, and they use this in rotation in terraces that they built on the steep slopes. The early gardeners, they gardened using the native vegetation that was available. So it was the Pacific banana, taro, yams, and sugarcane. Many areas of the Papua New Guinea provide archaeological and environmental evidence of forest clearing around about 10,000 years ago. In at least two sites, so we've got the Baleen up there, and then the Wagi, which is 500 miles away. In those two sites, they've taken pollen samples that from deposits that are 1,200 years old. And in those pollen samples, they discovered an increased growth of casuarina, which is a species that takes up growth opportunities very quickly once land has been cleared. So there's an indication that land was being cleared around about 12,000 years ago, very clearly. This innovation occurred separately and across different valleys. I'm just showing you the breadth of that occurrence that was going on. People still commonly uproot and transplant seedlings that naturally grow on the on the riverbanks of the casuarina because they're valuable in the sense that they are hardy ironwood, she oaks, and that the root nodules, they fix nitrogen in the soil. The root systems also help to maintain the soil so that you have less soil erosion on the steep slopes. The litter that comes from casuarinas, I don't know if you know the casuarinas, but they have long pine-like leaves, pine needle-like leaves. They can use that for mulching. And also, of course, they use the timber for building and for fuel. In the early to mid Holocene, 10,000 years ago, at the end of the last glacial maximum, there is an increase in the activity of trade and the exchange of materials between the islands around New Guinea, the coastal regions, and up into the higher montane areas. So people up in these areas were getting shell from the coastal regions. The major warming underway at the beginning of the Holocene brought about significant ecological changes that provided opportunities for the movement of people and resources. The tree line, for example, rose from 6,500 feet at the height of the last glacial maximum, the last glacial maximum being 15,000 years ago, to what it is today, just over 13,000 feet. So archaeological evidence indicates a much greater utilization of the highland sites during this period, with intensity of agricultural activity, and suggesting that there was a beginning of larger territories and settled landscapes. The lowlands, of course, underwent similar kinds of changes. There was lots of indication of clearing of the land for growing other taro as well as yams, and propagating sago to eat. 8,000 years ago, the land mass of New Guinea and Australia became separated. Cook is one of the places, the earliest sites that we have of this the agricultural activity, where we find very deep, sophisticated channels, as you can see in this other picture right there. Those lines are deep dug ancient channels that are dated to about 9,000 years ago. So it's up here in the Wagi Valley that we have the first evidence of archaeological activity. So while we have archaeological evidence for people moving into the upper slopes and adapting to the high altitudes from the early human occupation of the island, the intensity of that occupation in the highlands gathered momentum from about 10,000 years ago. Although Europeans had visited and claimed the island for the people of their respective countries, as early as the 16th century, they did not penetrate into these areas. They remained completely unaware of the populations existing up in these higher regions, hence the hidden valleys or the secret valleys that we often refer to. But there is nothing like striking gold to motivate Europeans to explore further afield in search of their fortunes. And indeed, that's what led to the discovery of these people in these valleys. In the early 1920s, they discovered gold on Bululo River. That's in the Morobe province, sparking a wave of explorations to explore these unexplored areas. In 1929, a group of gold prospectors attached to the Akama Gold Prospecting Company made their way from the Sepik Valley, forcing their way through dense forests and arduous climbing up into the Wabag Valley, where the home of the Enga people, and they discovered huge populations of people there. In the 1930s, Mick Leahy, together with Mick Dyer, two Australian gold prospectors, explored further into New Guinea's hinterland, coming across the Wagi Valley, which is about there. They found, as they're moving into the area, so they're climbing up from the Sepik River, as they moved through, they found not so densely populated areas, but they found densely populations of people that were up there. And so they, just in moving towards the Wagi Valley, they discovered that there were people further than the colonial governments had assumed prior to that period. In 1931, Mick Leahy and his brother, they explored Kuka Kuka land, which is again in the Morobe province, and they live in high altitudes in the Morobe province. That's just southeast of where I've got Wagi Valley shown on that map. On two of the pioneering flights that they made, they flew over the Wagyu Valley and looked down over densely populated, much more densely populated areas that they did not think were up there. Consequently, the Leahy brothers led an expedition into the area in 1933. This expedition has been captured in a documentary called First Contact, which some of you might have seen. Certainly those of you who've traveled up to the Highlands with me have seen it. And the documentary uses the footage that the Leahy brothers actually took of their encounters with the people up in the area. It's quite astounding footage. At the same time, well, not at nearly the same time, the American zoologist Richard Archbold, who was very rich, sponsored exploratory flights from what is now Jaipur up there that you can see, and in over the Balim Valley. Jaipur is the current capital of the Papuan Indonesia. They flew over mountain ranges in 1938 and 1939 in a PBY-2 Catalina flying boat, so that they could land on rivers and they could land on lakes to resupply themselves, but also to collect specimens for their scientific purposes. On June 23rd, 1938, they flew over a large valley, and looking down on it, they could see vast populations. They named it Groot Valley, or Grand Valley. However, the people that were living there call it the Balim Valley. 2 months later, Archbold sent 2 expeditions led by Dutch soldiers, taking with them Indonesian prisoners who were fighting against the Dutch in the Indonesian islands, and also people from the island of Borneo as porters. The Dani, of course, resisted all of the attempts for these people to come into the area, but they did come into the area and discovered these people, the Dani. So that is how the people of these leaving their Stone Age lives, hidden in the valleys dotted across the spine of New Guinea, became known to the colonial administrators, and then of course later to us, the rest of the world. The extreme topography separating ecological zones led to relative isolation between the communities, contributing to high diversity of cultures and languages. It is often said in New Guinea, one valley, one culture, one language, because of these very diverse and very rugged landscapes to be moving through. So people didn't move very far before colonization, and even during colonization, between their valleys. They stayed pretty much into their own valleys. Today, Wikipedia says that there are 7,000 ethnic groups, cultural groups in Papua New Guinea alone. Now that, to me as an anthropologist, is somewhat problematic, because I know that it depends on obviously how you define a group, how you define their differences between each other groups, or how you define their similarities. This is how you define how many groups there are. Indeed, communities are often lumped together by governments or by colonial powers, just as the ease of being able to classify them or to control them. But the people themselves might actually recognize differences between themselves and see themselves as different groups. So how you come up with 7,000 names or different groups is a bit problematic from my perspective. Indeed, I can even give an example of the Asmat, which many of you have visited. The Asmat actually see themselves as being 5 different groups. They're not the Asmat, they are different groups. But the colonial government and now the Indonesian government recognizes them as the Asmat, and they now identify somewhat as the Asmat, but within the group, they identify as 5 separate groups with different languages. So just given that little proviso, let's just consider that there might be 7,000 ethnic groups in Papua New Guinea alone. There are 46 associated with West Papua in the Indonesian side, and 261 in Papua, again, the Indonesian side. So if we consider that that's the case, that's 10,000, just about 10,000 different ethnic groups. And as I'm saying, that is somewhat problematic. So there could even be more different groups. While some of the valleys are home to densely populated agricultural groups like the Melpa in the Wagi Valley and the Dani in the Balim Valley, the majority of valleys are home to smaller villages. And these village communities have very difficult access into their areas. They have to march or climb for days to get between valleys and into other valley areas. Let's have a look at some of the cultural groups of the spine of the Highlands of New Guinea. We're going to start with the Tari, or the Huli, and of the Tari Valley. And the Huli trace their descent. They're quite different from most of the majority of Highland communities, in that they trace their descent through both the male and the female line. So they're unusual in that sense, and it's hard to know how that happened. That means that the kin groups can find their relationships on both mother's and father's side. And it means that residence is also quite flexible. So people who are, particularly men, in wanting to take up opportunistic movement, can move between their mother's and their father's groups and find land and support allies. Most of the other Highlanders, by far the majority, are strictly patrilineal. They trace their descent through males, and they find their relationships through fathers. The Huli are commonly known as the Huli wigmen, and they're renowned for their wigs, their headdresses. The wigs are made from real hair collected from boys. So when the boys at a very young age, not this age, a little bit older than this age, but when boys are initiated, they leave the society of women and they go and live in secluded places in the forest for a very long time, years. They live there. And while they're in seclusion, the boys grow their hair. And every day they wash their hair in iron-rich waters of the rivers that they live in, near. And during this time, every day they wash their hair, but during this time they learn to become men. They learn the traditions of the Huli. They learn the taboos. They learn how to self-decorate. They learn how to be warriors. They learn all the things that they need to know to be good Huli men in their communities. They also learn to purify themselves, because amongst the Huli and amongst most Highlanders, they recognize that women are highly, highly contaminated. They're very, very dangerous. So men try to stay away from women as much as possible. If they are in contact with women, they purify themselves by collecting razor sharp blades of grass and stick it down their throats to induce vomiting, or stick it up their nose or up their urethra to cause bleeding. And they do this regularly. When the boys return from their seclusion, they have a ceremonial hair cutting where all their head is shaved and they begin to make their headdresses, the helmets of hair that they use. Now, the other male relatives will contribute to the young man's wig at that particular time, but throughout the rest of his life, he contributes his own hair to the wig until he gets the fine wig that you can see on this older man. And in this picture, you can see the older man actually working with one of these wigs. It's all hair that's been densely packed, and he picks at it to keep it so that it looks fresh and whatnot. Once they're ready to do their performances, they adorn these wigs with the birds of paradise feathers, as you can see this man is wearing. So you can see now here the difference between the actual wig and then the adornment that they put on. When the dancing ceremony is over, they take the feathers very carefully out of the headdress, the wig, the hair wig, and place them into safekeeping until the next time, because the feathers are very valuable. The birds of paradise, each bird of paradise has a specific relationship to the people, or has a particular attribute that the Huli consider to be very advantageous. Attributes such as astuteness, happiness, shrewdness, intelligence, courage. And by putting the feathers on, the men believe they take on those attributes from the various birds of paradise. So you can see here, the man hasn't completely put all the birds of paradise on the top of his wig, but you can see quite clearly the wig before it's completed with the addition of the feathers. Their faces are painted bright colors. And the last one you could see, I'll just go back to that one. You can see that basically the face is yellow and it's outlined in thin red lines. Around the eyes, he paints black to highlight his eyes, and white in his beard if he has a beard. These younger men don't have beards, or they do have beards, you can see, and they've got red on their beards instead of the white. So this is a fully dressed, fully decorated huli man in preparation for dancing. As I said, women are considered to be powerful and very, very dangerous. Men have as little to do with them as possible. A woman's menstrual cycle is the most dangerous time for a man, and so women leave the village completely and go into secluded huts deep into the forest. If you could say that it's women's monthly holiday. They can get away from having to tend to the children and the pigs and working in the garden. So they go off and have a week's holiday, 7 days holiday. Men and boys, even in the village, they sleep in separate longhouses. They don't sleep with men. The women sleep with uninitiated boys, girls, and their pigs. Men even cook for themselves, because to eat food that has been cooked by the hand of women is way too dangerous. And if they do come into contact with women, as you do when you're procreating your own lineage, then they have to go out into the bush and they bleed themselves, as I already described. After the birth of a child, a huli woman has an abstinence from sexual contact for about 7 years. So that really enhances the survival of the child, but it also means that the population is practicing very effective birth control. The Azaro Valley lies near Goroka, the provincial center of the Eastern Highlands. The area is home to the Azaro people, popularly known for their unique mudman performance in mud masks. They silently emerge out of the bush, stealthily making their way towards an unsuspecting enemy. The legend has it that there was a time in the past when the Azaro were attacked by a neighboring group. Defeated, the Azaro were driven off their land and ran off to a nearby river where they sheltered. Here they smeared their bodies with the mud from the river in order to blend themselves into the environment so that the attackers wouldn't find them. When the attackers finally did get to the river, they saw these bodies that were smeared in white, and they thought that they were the dead spirits of the people they had just killed in the fighting, the ghosts of the spirits of the Azaro. And being very frightened, all people are very frightened of the ghosts of the spirits of the dead, they fled. Well, the Azaro, thinking that was really good, they thought, how can we enhance the fear of our assailants? So they made these mud masks, painted their bodies with the clay, the white clay of the river, and they went into their own land, into the usurpers, and chased them out, because the usurpers were afraid of the spirits of the dead. So that is how they came to be known as the Mudmen, and how they got their famous appellation, the Azaro Mudmen. Now, raids to capture pigs and women and land are a very common and a precarious way of life in the highlands of New Guinea, right up until the mid-20th century, when the colonial governments were able to somehow suppress warfare. People throughout the highlands lived in a perpetual state of intergroup conflict, and they still do. Still, there are conflicts that rise every now and then. War is primarily the occupation of men, and that is the way men get a lot of their status, and their prowess and prestige comes from their ability to be good fighting warriors. People in the highlands also live by the concept of revenge. So if one of your kinsmen is killed, then you're bound to go and revenge his or her death. And that then perpetuates the continuing cycle of wars amongst people in the Highlands. Even when you have these cycles of war, when the hostilities begin to decrease, you then have to compensate the deceased, the members of the living of the deceased members with large numbers of pigs and sweet potatoes, and hence you get the beginnings of the ongoing, highly regulated exchanges amongst people in the Highlands. I'll be talking about that in a little bit later. Another group is called the Simbu of the Chimbu province, and they live near the Chimbu, in the Chimbu, Koro, and Wagi valleys, located in the Central Highlands between Mount Hagen and Goroka. Like most people living in the scattered, isolated valleys of the Central Cordillera, the Chimbu identity is based more on relationships of members between groups. So then basically their membership is clan identified rather than Chimbu. The only reason that they would adopt a Chimbu identity is when they are in relationships with other, or up against another group like the Hageners, the Melpa, or the Azaro, for example. So those appellations of Chimbu were really, or Azaro, or Melpa, or Enga, really only came into salient meaning when up against completely different groups. And that really only occurred predominantly after the cessation of warfare and the movement of the colonial governments into the regions to stop warfare and to colonize and to get the provisions out of the areas for their own growth, their own resource enhancement for the colonial governments. The term Chimbu was given to them by, so they're actually called Simbu, but the term Chimbu was given to them by yours truly, Mick Leahy, who came into the area in 1934. And when he came in, he heard them calling out Chimbu, Simbu, which it means Chimbu, which means in their language, an expression of surprise. So they got called the Chimbu, and hence that's what they're called today. As is the case for most Highlanders, the primary subsistence crop is sweet potato today. In the past, when the agriculture started, remember, it was sugarcane, Pacific banana, taro, and yams. Today, it's sweet potato, and that's a whole other story that I could go on to, maybe if you have questions about that. But today, sweet potato is the predominant food source for these people, and pigs and cassowary meat and whatnot. The diet of the Chimbu is 75% sweet potato, and they grow up to 130 different cultigens, varieties of sweet potato, and they use those cultigens for different purposes. So some of the cultigens just go for feeding pigs, some of the cultigens just go for exchange, so they get exchanged raw, some of the cultigens get cooked and then exchanged cooked, some of the cultigens get used just for their own eating. So it's they use them in different ways, and they also grow in different ecozones within the Highlands. As you can see here, women are the main gardeners, and that has been the case right in the whole past. So men may do the most of the heavy lifting in the clearing of the gardens, but it is women who are in charge of the cultivation of sweet potato and the raising of pigs. Following pacification, men were lured to work in plantations and often away from their valleys. But that didn't affect the subsistence of the communities, because the women just continued doing what they do. You can see them here. They're using the traditional main tool. It's called the digging stick. It's fire hardened on the tip, and it's a very, very easy tool to use, very effective and easy to replace should they get broken. And they continue to use digging sticks today. The gardens produce, so sweet potato also is very advantageous because you can have multiple crops throughout the year, depending on how the cultigen and how you grow it and when you grow it. So it's a constant provision of food throughout the year for people. And of course, the intensity of the growing, they have to grow intensely. They don't just grow what they can eat. They grow huge variety, numbers of food in order to be able to exchange. So exchange is the main reason they have high intensity cultivation in the highlands, right across the highlands, not just amongst the Chimbu. The Chimbu. The Chimbu today are known for the skeleton dances, and these are usually performed by young boys. Their bodies, as you can see here, are smeared black, and over that they paint on the skeletal images of their ancestral spirits. So they perform these dances to mimic the ancestral spirits, but also to ward them away from the village. So people are highly sensitive to the nefarious effects of dead ancestors. So they try to keep the dead ancestors appeased by doing a dance and walking them out of the village. So these young boys, they mimic the movement of the deceased, and they dance in the village, around the village, taking the spirits to the village, and then walk them out of the village into the forest where there's the spirits are supposed to stay. They don't like having them into the villages because they can be dangerous, the restless spirits. They also, it could be that in the past, they used this as a defense against potentially attacking enemies. Again, as just like in the mudbend, people are fearful of the ancestral spirits of the deceased that they've killed. So if you're walking around looking like the deceased, it will ward off any potential attackers. And the Chimbu skeleton dancers are very effective in their dances. Moving to the Melpa of the Wagi Valley, which lies 16,000 feet higher than the Sepik Basin, river basin, making it considerably cooler and relatively mosquito-free. The valley is home to the Melpa language-speaking people and is one of the largest population densities in the whole island of New Guinea. It is in this valley that the archaeologists first found the evidence of high intensity agricultural pursuits back 10,000 years ago in Cook tea plantation. Today, those are the legacy of those early 9,000-year-old agriculturists. The legacy is today is the high intensity, very sophisticated means of agricultural pursuits of the highlands. For hundreds of generations, Melpa men have exchanged women in marriage, and it's not just Melpa, this is right across, but I'm going to talk about the Melpa and their marriage systems. They marry between the interrelated valleys of Melpa-speaking people. So I'm saying Melpa-speaking people because within the term Melpa are different language groups, different dialects and different groups. They identify them as different, but they speak a dialect of a Melpa language. And they would have married between those villages outside of their own villages. So they practice exogamous marriage, which means you have to marry outside of your group. This not only ensures that you get exchange partners, but you also get allies so that you can form alliances against people who might be wanting to attack your village. Also gives you cultural links and sharing of resources. So it's really important that you make these marriages across groups, between groups. Women are not considered part of a system of egalitarianism. So amongst all Highlanders, there is a system of egalitarian relationships, but that is only between initiated men. Women and children don't feature in that at all. And in that system, there is no formal leadership. There's no one man, there's no one family that has a right to lead a group. everybody has the potential, every male, initiated male, has the potential to become what is called a big man, a leader. But that leadership is very difficult. It's not something that you own. You have to keep maintaining it. I've written a blog for Zegrahm in the past about really connecting big manship systems in New Guinea to the American presidential system. It's the same sort of thing. You've got this polity called the President of the United States, but big men challenge each other to get into that position, and they can't stay forever. They get wiped back out again. So it's very similar in a lot of ways to what happens in the big man system in New Guinea, in the New Guinea Highlands. So as I said, there's no formal leadership. There is a position that big men aspire to. And it takes certain qualities to become a big man. You have to have good oratorical skills. You need to be able to convince people to do what you want them to do, but you have to convince them. They don't necessarily have to do what you want them to do. You have to have good managerial skills over manipulating the movement of people and their wealth. So you have to be able to get people to do what you want to do and get their wealth so that you can manage that wealth. You have to have the ability to resolve disputes. You have to have the good warfare. You have to have been a good warrior. So there's all of those skills that you need to become a big man. It's not inherited. A son of a big man does not necessarily become a big man himself. You have to become a big man, and people have to support you in that. So let's look at some big men. Big men have many wives. I started out talking about the Melpa with the fact that they marry and have many wives. So much of the communications between different Melpa speaking groups is to get wives of the big men. If you're not a big man, you do not have access to multiple wives because it costs a lot of money in bride price to get multiple wives. Now, why would a big man want multiple wives? To garden for him. He's going to need many more sweet potatoes to exchange, many more pigs to be able to exchange, and the women are the ones that garden and look after the pigs. Also, each one of those women has a whole kin group behind her to support her husband, the big man. So he's got 4 different alliances in this picture if he only has 4 wives. He actually has, this particular one has more than 4 wives. These are the only ones that would come out for a photograph. So he's able to manipulate at least 4 different kin groups that he's attached to through marriage. The big man can easily be toppled. It's a very precarious position. So if he makes the wrong decision or he doesn't look after his kin groups by giving them periodic pigs or periodically giving them sweet potatoes or valuables in any way or support, then his strength as a big man wanes and another aspiring big man will take his position. So it's a very precarious position to be in, and you're certainly not there for your entire life. Some are, but most people are not big men for their entire adult lives. You can see on this particular big man, he's wearing a length of bamboo pegs down his neck. And here's another man with his pegs down his neck. So you can see the difference. One is a very well-established big man with at least 4 wives. This man has a couple of wives, but see the neck thing down, the bamboo pegs down his torso indicate that he has less status than the man with the longer pegs. Each one of those pegs represents a mocha, an exchange of pigs that the man has contributed pigs to. So that's how many mochas the man on the left has been involved in, and the man on the right is he's pretty old, so he's not going to have many more mochas that he can engage in. So a mocha is, for the Melpa people, a mocha is a pig exchange in which they exchange hundreds, if not thousands, of pigs. At the end of the mocha, they slaughter the pigs and distribute meat to allies and to potential allies. It's a non-ending giving of produce, which if you've given your enemy or your rival 100 pigs, then the rival is in debt to you. at a certain period in 5 years, not much longer than that, because if it goes too long, then your status goes down even further. But within a period of 3 to 5 years, then the rival who received the pigs has to then repay the debt with more pigs. 100, he was given 100 pigs, he has to give 150 pigs or more, something like that, in order for the balance of their debt to change back and forth. You never want it to be even, because that kills the relationship. So it's a constant up and down. So you can see, if I give Tom here 100 pigs, Tom's going to have to give me 150 pigs. The next time I'm going to have to give you 200 pigs, then you're going to have to give me 250 pigs to keep our relationship unbalanced. Does that make sense? It's a really interesting phenomena for Highlanders in New Guinea. Pigs are by far the most important animal in the domesticated animal amongst the people of the Highlands, but I'm talking now about the Melpa. So they're not food. They don't raise pigs for food. They eat pigs as they get exchanged to them, but they never, very rarely do they kill their own pigs. There are some groups in the Southern Highlands that did kill pigs for ancestors, and those groups are really interesting in that they would raise up hundreds of thousands of pigs, and then on one day they would slaughter them all, kill them all, and that would feed all of the men, and they would go to war. So that's a really interesting group, couple of groups down in the Southern Highlands. But in the Central Highlands, they didn't do that kind of pig display and pig slaughter for the ancestors. They were slaughtering pigs and raising pigs to give to other people for exchange. The Melpa are well known again too for their dancing, their face painting, and their dresses. You can see in this picture here that they're not using wigs. What they have is they have billums. Women weave these billums that they use for all kinds of things, carrying babies, carrying firewood, carrying sweet potato, carrying piglets. But they make them for men to use for their headdresses. And what the men do is they put these billums in over their heads, and they stuff them with grass and whatnot to build them out. And so you can see, if I can go back, you can see their headdresses are not nearly as elaborate in the sense of the actual headdress as the huli. But these men, they then put these wonderful, beautiful, very elaborate headdresses on top of their billums of various feathers, mostly birds of paradise. And their painting is different from the enga that are nearby them and the huli that you've already seen. And the painting, the face painting, also has lots of symbolism, which again is another lecture. Moving 500 miles away, the Dani live in the Zegrahm Valley, and that's about 500 miles away, further to the west from the Wagi Valley. In the Zegrahm Valley are Dani speaking people. Again, they see themselves as distinct. Dani is the general term that we use to define these people who live in the Zegrahm Valley. And it's located high on the Indonesian side in the province of Papua. The valley is about 50 miles long and about 5.5 miles wide at its widest. And its altitude is 5,500 feet above sea level. The people, like other Highlanders, live in are patrilineal. They marry outside, they raise pigs, they grow sweet potato. That's their major food. But the thing that the Dani makes them stand out is that I've talked about warfare in the other parts of the Highlands, but the Dani perfected it in a ritualized way. They're well known for their ritualized and haphazard warfare. Until the 1960s, intergroup warfare was endemic in the Zegrahm Valley. The Dani organized themselves into relatively fluid alliances. So they've got their clans, but then they align themselves into alliances with their married, with their wives groups. So they've got a marriage alliance between those groups. Those alliances also then reintegrate or integrate into larger, you could call confederacies, if you like. So lots and lots of groups of people coalesce into a group to be able to fight off another group that equally coalesces into these alliances, these confederations. Each alliance was at war with the others. So there was a constant endemic warfare amongst the Dani. It was, again, men get their prestige from it. They don't really do any gardening. It's women who do all the gardening. So the men are free to fight each other, basically for prestige and to get women and to get land. Because every death requires another death, you have to revenge for your deceased kin, the cycle of killing would keep going. So warfare was a non-ending cycle. And amongst the Dani, they had a ritualized warfare, as well as a more haphazard, random killing of individuals or raiding villages. In the ritualized warfare, these men would, you could get up to 1,000 men fighting on one side, and they would be facing off each other, much like the battles we see of early England. And between Scotland, you'd have these big battles fighting off each other. In between is no man's land. If you crossed into that no man's land, then you're fair game. But then they would, in the ritualized battles, they would come together and fight for 2 or 3 hours, finish, go back and live in their villages for another maybe 5, 7, 10 days. And then they would come back again and have again another ritualized fighting. This ritualized fighting was captured in an ethnographic documentary film called Dead Birds. So if you're interested in having a look at that, it's called Dead Birds. And it does look at this very interesting ritualized fighting. Of course, between that ritualized fighting, men would sneak across and get into a village and wipe out indiscriminately men, women, and children in that village, get back again. And of course, alliances of the deceased would then have to then ritually fight those other people again. So it's this constant fighting. And it was really the ritualized fighting that first the Dutch and then the Indonesian governments were able to somewhat suppress. So there's virtually no ritualized warfare amongst the Dani anymore, but there are ongoing skirmishes that continue to plague the Dani up in the Balim Valley. Compensation, of course. So so I said that this ritualized conflicts would happen for about a decade. After people, the reason why people were fighting, kind of the idea of it started to fade away, then they would come together in big pig feasts, big pig exchanges, and then feasting to compensate the dead people that they no longer wanted to fight to get revenge for. So you would have this decade-long fighting. Then the reason for the fighting would diminish in people's memories, and they would try to find peace with these massive exchanges of pigs and sweet potato particularly. And then once confederacies would start to fight against each other, thinking, well, you didn't really support us in that particular battle, so you're now going to be our enemy. So the whole thing would rev it back up again, and you'd have another outburst of killing amongst the people. So it wasn't until the mid-60s that was relatively stopped by the colonial powers and the Indonesians. And you could still say that in the Indonesian New Guinea is still a colonial power because people are still fighting for their independence, called the West Papua, the Morning Star movement. Anyway, the good news is that we plan to visit the two main valleys in next year. Anybody itching, ready to go on a trip? Well, we can go and visit the Dani up in the Wamena, near Wamena in the Balim Valley in August next year. Our timing is significant. Many of you will have heard about the Mount Hagen cultural show, or the Goroka cultural show, in which hundreds of cultural groups get together and they demonstrate their own cultural heritage through dances and costumes and whatnot. And it's like a competition between groups all over Papua New Guinea. But what's less known is the Baleen Valley cultural show. And of course, because it's less known, there's less people. So we're targeting that one instead of the Hagen or the Goroka show. But you can't go to New Guinea and not go to Mount Hagen and see the Wagi Valley area. So what we plan to do is to spend 3 good days up in the Wagi Valley, where people who we will see at least 5 different cultural groups. We'll see the Huli, we'll see the Chimbu, we'll see the Azaro and the Melpa, of course, people. Sometimes we get to see the Anga as well. And the reason being that lots of people from various different valleys have come to Mount Hagen, being one of the provincial center, looking for economic employment. And they've settled in the Wagi Valley. So we get to visit some of these people who will, and they perform shows just for us in the valley. So we'll be there. And then we will aim to head up via Jaipur to the Wamena and into the Baleen for the Baleen cultural show, and spend 3 or 4 days just visiting there and seeing the cultural show there. But I should say, you can't go to New Guinea and not visit the Sepik. So we also plan to go to the Sepik River and be on the Karaway River. Now, a little bit about the Sepik is it starts way up here in the Victor Emmanuel mountain range, right about there, about 10,000 feet above sea level. And that meanders its way for a good 700 miles down serpentine-like through the mountain down into the Sepik Basin, and finishes at the mouth of the Bismarck, enters into the Bismarck Sea at this little tiny village called Kopar, which, if you've been on some of our voyages, we often stop at that little village at Kopar. So the length of the river is 700 miles, but it's also got tributaries. So there's about 250 different cultural groups, completely different language cultural groups along the Sepik River. We will be over the Karaway River. That's where we will aim to go. There are no roads in the area at all, except for a little road from our landing point on the river up to the lodge where we'll stay on the Karaway, which is in the middle Sepik area. There are 3 different linguistic groups in the Karaway River system itself. So just in the tributary, the little tributary, there are 3 different language groups. The main one is the Yokwime, who claim to be the strongest. And in the past, they fought the other 2 and diminished their numbers and pushed them back further up towards these mountains here. But the 3 of them are still there. The Yokwime being the strongest. The river is the main subsistence of the people. They take fish from the river. But also the stands of sago palms drink up the moisture-laden soils enriched by the waters of the Karaway. So these people are basically fish and sago eaters, not sweet potato eaters, completely different groups altogether. They are, or used to be, fierce headhunters and cannibals. The people practice cult of the ancestors and cults of spirits, particularly the crocodile spirit. So many of them used to get scarification on their backs, women and men, during initiation to signify their relationship to crocodile spirit, which is in the rivers. And although the Germans, they were in this part of the world, they didn't leave the mouth of the river, because they knew that up the river, these people were cannibals and headhunters. So they stayed fairly close to the Bismarck Sea, where they had their camps. But the knowledge of the Germans, and then later the Australian colonial people, the knowledge of these people went right up the river through the languages, through villages after village, sharing the information about these strangers. So these strangers were well known up the river well before the white people ever got up those areas in the early 20th century. And that's where I'm going to leave it. So yeah, so I'd love to have you come and join me for that trip. I think it's already half booked, but so it would be lovely to have some more of you there. We will be up close and friendly with the rich cultures that I've talked about. And we will learn an awful lot more and see an awful lot more. And even those of you who've gone before to these areas, it's always different. I've been a good couple dozen times to these areas, and every single time it's different. Anyway, thanks very much for listening. I hope that you've learned something about the secret valleys of the island of New Guinea.